Mr. King.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, first, as I open this up, I regret the gentleman from Oregon's not here. I hope someone passes him along the message. He seems to be pretty thin-skinned about partisanship. I was listening to the gentleman from Illinois' statement about running the pizza place, and even though I'm kind of happy about pork prices going up 30%, I didn't hear anything partisan in there except the phrase Obamacare. And I'd point out to the panel that to my recollection, and I think it could be easily referenced, that that phrase was given life and momentum and perhaps coined by the President himself on February 25th, 2009 at the Blair House. We remember that healthcare summit that's there. And so when I'm looking through the polling results, the Gallup poll results, I'm actually surprised at these results, Dr. Jacoby. In that I started a small business in 1975. I'm at payroll for over 1,440 consecutive weeks. I sold that business to my oldest son, and it and a spinoff of it go on today dealing with all these government regulations. I'm pretty sure if I ask two of my sons that are in that business now what the number one issue was, we would have probably gotten Obamacare as the biggest load that they would be facing. And I see that down there. Well, wait a minute. It's a new health care policy at 5%. Now, I'm wondering if some of the people that said complying with government regulations at 22% aren't also thinking of Obamacare as at least as a component of that. But I'd ask you to speculate. If that had been phrased differently, the way Mr. Schilling phrases it and I phrase it, what kind of a response do you think there would be a change up or down in that number of 5% on the new health care policy concern?
Well, it's not real good to speculate on the question design and responses. My guess is there is some mixing in that area. If you look on the testimony after those two tables, and then I have a part that starts that talks about the worries, and when we asked people why they weren't hiring. And if you look down that list, you see that the potential cost of health care is the 48%, and then the government regulations is 46% in terms of where we allowed them to have multiple answers. Now, those answers come after statements about revenues and cash flows as major concerns of small business, but they're all there in the top 5.
Well, thank you, Dr. Jacoby, and I think you've added clarity to this. As just a quick read of the poll doesn't go as deep as what you have in. And I would add to our background on this, the special election in the state of Ohio that took place perhaps a month and a half or so ago, and it was for the purposes of repealing the collective bargaining legislation that was passed there and signed by Governor Kasich. So, I mean, we know that there were tens of millions spent to get people to the polls. It was a union-heavy turnout. 61% rejected the collective bargaining language. And initiative number 3, right behind the initiative number 2, which I've mentioned, was to exempt Ohioans by amending their constitution to the individual health care mandate. And that passed, and they amended their constitution with 66%. So I thought that was a pretty powerful poll on the public's acceptance of Obamacare. And would you care to comment on that, Dr. Jacoby?
I think that the way we phrased it in our question was the cost of health care. And the way most Americans and small businesses, I think, are perceiving whatever you say about Obamacare is in the cost of health care to them.
What's the average size of the businesses that were polled?
There are businesses that have less than $20 million in revenues or sales. Most of them are under $1 million.
The numbers of their employees, do you have that?
No, I can give that to you, but it's a relatively
up to $20 million. Thank you. I'd turn then to Dr. Bailey and ask, what would, in your estimation, be the grandest Keynesian experiment in the history of the world? The largest, most expansive, grandest Keynesian experiment?
World War II?
Oh, I didn't expect that answer. Because I thought we were fighting to defend liberty and freedom, and it wasn't a Keynesian experiment at all. And I've never heard it expressed as a means for our economy to recover.
But it did. It did. We got very large government spending. And we
that would be the president's theory as well. I'm going to give you how about we go with a multiple choice here? Because that Keynesian experiment did not begin at World War II. And we know that. It began with the initiatives of perhaps the Iowa president, and then certainly with the New Deal of FDR. There was a follow-through of that under the same president all the way through. Then I'll ask you this. Do you know when the stock market recovered from its peak in October of 1929, when it finally got back to that level?
No, I don't.
Does anyone on the panel know that answer?
I think it was after World War II, I think.
Yes. Mr. Frederick?
Well, I was just going to say 1946.
1954.
Oh.
FDR had been dead for 9 years by the time the grand Keynesian experiment came back around to breaking even. And so that's a depressing thing to think about, the Great Depression, how long it took to come back from the Great Depression.
If you give me a second crack at that, I'd say Europe is providing a very good Keynesian experiment. They're all trying to reduce spending and raise taxes, so and they're all finding they're going into recession as a result. So that's the other side of the Keynesian coin.
Well, the Germans are doing pretty well and have all throughout.
Yeah, but they didn't do any contraction.
That's true, because they didn't experiment in the Keynesian fashion that the rest of Europe did. Because they fear inflation and they fear interest rates. But Mr. Ferrara, I wanted to ask you, what if we were to, as a former Massachusetts governor has advocated, repeal Dodd-Frank, the Community Reinvestment Act, privatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, and repeal Sarbanes-Oxley, what do you think would become of our recovery?
That would be a very good component on the deregulation component of the 4 points of Reaganomics that I mentioned. And I just want to say on that grand Keynesian experiment, World War II, check out what consumers happened to the trends in consumer spending during World War II to see if that really was a Keynesian experiment. I think you'll find that it was not having any kind of Keynesian effect, and that's why the recovery didn't really come till later.
And just in conclusion, as my time is wearing down here, does anyone have the answer to, here are the unemployment numbers, how many are unemployed, how many are no longer qualified to meet the category of unemployment? Does anyone have the answer on how many Americans are of working age who are simply not in the workforce?
Yeah, I think that's gone up recently. I think that's been going up. The Bureau of Labor Statistics has has that data.
Let me just respond to my own question then, and that is, I've tracked this for 6 or 7 years, and there are different ways to define it. So you say Americans of working age not in the workforce. That number, roughly not quite 14 million unemployed, added to those off the Department of Labor's website. I started at 16, and I went to where unemployment is no longer paid and where Walmart doesn't hire. That is 74. Over 100 million Americans of working age simply not in the workforce. I just think that's an astonishing figure and worthy of consideration. I think your book's worth reading, too. Thank you very much, and I yield back.